Thank you, Jen. That was a good setup for this discussion. We are going to be the government people. We're going to talk policy and why policy change, funding, of the way the government makes the decisions. Am I loud enough? No, I'm getting some signals back there. Is my thing on? All right, there we go. So we are looking forward to talking about how government can play a better role in the shift toward investing in results and outcomes. We have an excellent pair here to talk about this. One Democrat, one Republican.
Hello.
Did you all see that?
Thank you.
Now we can all go home, right?
Right.
We have a former White House official, and we have a mayor of a large major city that purchases these kinds of services and knows what it takes to deliver when we in Washington sit back and send the money out. Like, what does it actually take? So first, Mayor Nutter, you served for 15 years on the Philadelphia City Council, 2 terms as mayor of Philadelphia. You drove crime rates down dramatically, and you drove high school graduation rates up really significantly. You made a lot of good promises during your campaign, and you kept a lot of them as well, using evidence and data. You're president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and then since leaving office in 2016, you've worn many hats. Columbia University, CNN contributor. My favorite hat, of course, is the senior fellow and national spokesperson for Bloomberg Philanthropies What Works Cities program, which Results for America organizes. We also have John Bridgeland, who we all call Bridge, affectionately, everyone calls. Director of the Domestic Policy Council in the Bush administration, as well as the first director of Freedom Corps. Founder of CEO of Civic Enterprises. And I think probably the biggest champion of getting rid of malaria globally, Malaria No More, as well as National Service, 2 of your, I know, deep projects, also one of our senior fellows. So I wanted to start the questions first, kind of high level, talking about evidence and data on sort of the bigger picture, and then go down more directly tied to the book and some of the things that Jen had talked about when she was doing this initial presentation. So first, the report from the Ryan Murray Evidence-Based Policy Making Commission was released just a few days ago. We, in this sort of outcomes, results, evidence and data world, were encouraged. It was bipartisan. Ryan and Murray both showed up at a press conference, talked about legislation. It was exciting, to think that we could do these kinds of bipartisan things legislatively, potentially. So do you want to talk about why you think it's an important step forward and what you think the potential is for actually enacting some of the recommendations?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. Newsflash, Congress acts. It's so exciting. First of all, just a privilege to be on a panel with Mayor Nutter. We worked closely together many years ago on the role of faith-based and national service initiatives in Philadelphia. And I just have to say, I started reading this book last night, and I always feel better when the Federal Reserve and the Nonprofit Finance Fund get in the game. It's a stunning book. I had my light on at 1 o'clock in the morning. My wife turned to me and said, "What novel are you reading?" And I was actually a little embarrassed to tell her what I was reading. But the way you talk about ecosystems and no single program being the focus of our energy, and then hearing from Eric and David and Jen about the multiple effects in communities on all sectors.
Is your mic on?
It's just so encouraging.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear a word.
Yeah. He's going to start over.
Okay. Do I need to start over?
No. So we're going to ask who else in the room has read this with such rigor.
Yeah.
So anyway, 1 in the morning last night.
So Congress finally, RFA has been pushing this evidence-based policy commission for quite some time in our congressional testimony and the commission testimony. To me, what's so hopeful about it is that when you look at the history of government reform and efforts to boost performance, you go back to President William Howard Taft, who recommended an executive budget in 1912. You look at the Brownlow Commission, you look at 2 Hoover commissions, you look at the Grace Commission, and most of the energy was really led by presidents and the executive branch. And so what's really encouraging to me is Congress is actually recognizing with the power of the purse, the power of oversight, its institutional reach, its ability to send signals through the system, it's really significant that the Speaker of the House and a senior senator, Democrat from Washington, is stepping up to join hands. The second thing that gives me hope is that RFA and others have been pushing concrete institutional changes that will actually make a difference. The first, that you'd have chief evaluation officers in departments and agencies, people at the senior level who are actually responsible for looking at research and data and evaluation in a very deliberate, comprehensive way. Second, RFA and others have been pushing this idea of 1% of appropriation. So it's going to mean very little if Peter Orszag and I wrote this article for The Atlantic called "Can Government Play Moneyball?" And the former OMB directors had done an analysis showing that less than one out of every $100 spent by the government is backed by the even most basic evidence. And so having 1% or 0.5% of appropriations for the Department of Labor, Department of Education, actually investing in building an evidence base, is common sense, makes good sense. But now the Congress, on a bipartisan basis, at a pretty senior level, seems to be embracing it. The third thing I like to highlight is Gene Sperling and I always have this back and forth about it can't just be an on-off switch. You can't say, well, this evaluation or this particular evidence shows a program doesn't work, so let's just cut it off. We need to create an environment of continuous learning in departments and agencies. And so I love this notion that's in the report that talks about creating learning agendas within departments and agencies. And then radical thought, actually having the sharing and collaboration cross departments, because as you all well know, the executive branch wasn't set up in a way that it really has just one agency or one program targeting problems. You often find HHS, education, even commerce, working on issues that are unexpected. So those three things give me a lot of hope for this Evidence-Based Policy Commission. And hats off to you, Michele, and your team for having stayed with it. And it's a good lesson in civic education, how you can actually work a problem and see it come to fruition.
So at the federal level, the money flows out, and it flows out to the cities and the states, but the cities that actually have to deliver and actually deliver addressing the problem, delivering the services. And when you were mayor of Philadelphia, I know you put an extra special focus on making sure that the services had the impact that that the residents were promised. Right. You were incredibly focused on especially around crime data. Created this partnership with Temple University, which I think was quite interesting, and maybe it could be borrowed by other cities, knowing that local universities can often be a resource for the city. Can you talk a little bit about sort of both your, how you made this a priority, and then a little bit about that partnership with Temple?
Much like John and certainly Michele, excited to be here. And again, thank you to the Federal Reserve and NFF. I looked at our college and university network in Philadelphia and the tri-state area. About 101 colleges and universities, one of the most education-rich regions in the United States of America. I'm sure there are some folks here from Boston. I mean, no insult to you, but we actually have more than you do. But we don't need to quibble over those facts. The government at all levels, local, state, federal, we spend so much time, either mostly the states and the federal governments don't so much manage programs, they do send the money sometimes. We have to deliver services. And so most days we are so focused on delivering the services that you don't have a whole lot of time for evaluation and analysis. That doesn't mean that folks aren't doing that kind of work, but it's not, for most folks, that's not their day-to-day responsibility. And so I always look at colleges and universities as really not just the great educational institutions, but really almost like the research and development component of the city government and having those relationships. And so there were some great crime, public safety data folks up there, and they partnered with our then new police commissioner, Ramsey. We did an analysis of homicides and shootings all across Philadelphia over a pretty significant period of time. We had at the time 23 police districts, or in some jurisdictions they might be precincts, ours are districts. We found that 65% of the homicides in Philadelphia We're in 9 of those 23 police districts. And so, how we make decisions about deployment, where, and I was a city council member and loved my time there, and so, where you stand depends on where you sit. If you're a council member, you want an equal amount of resources everywhere, just kind of spread it all out, everybody, gets what they get. The data said we should have more officers and more resources over in these 9 police districts. And, we went through a process with data to redeploy the officers. And over my 8 years, and we did a bunch of different things, and it certainly wasn't just me, it was brave men and women in uniform. We had a 31% reduction in homicides in Philadelphia over an 8-year period of time. And that is really about data, it's about resources, and not just anecdotal information. And what the officers will tell you also is just good old police work. And so we benefited tremendously from those kinds of partnerships. Temple, Penn, St. Joe's, Drexel, a number of others, helping us to solve problems.
And how can that be a model for other cities, do you think? I mean, what are the key, sort of keys to that?
I think it can be, and again, we're very education, medicine rich in Philly. About 37% of the jobs in Philadelphia are tied to education and medicine, so it's a real big part of our economy. And I think, and the University of Pennsylvania is the largest non-government employer in the city of Philadelphia. So, I mean, they bring jobs, they bring money, they bring resources, young people, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, a mayor, a council member, any elected official, high appointed official, you want to have good, positive relationships with your college and university and hospital community. And they are a very rich resource. And in my view, underutilized at times in terms of what cities can do and what they need.
Yeah, and potentially a bridge between the nonprofit sector and,
Yep.
and the cities as well. So you both wrote an op-ed together in one other bipartisan effort. And you were making
We
the
argued the whole time.
Yeah. I don't remember it that way, but
8 months to do that.
But you consistently, both of you, believe that there's ways in which Democrats and Republicans can work together. And so knowing where we are today and with the politics at the national level, can you talk a little bit about why you are still optimistic that Democrats and Republicans can work together and make progress on this particular issue?
So I'm optimistic because there are people like Mayor Nutter in the world who are focused on wanting to do a good job and harnessing evidence. I'll tell you a little story. I was asked to testify before the House Ways and Means Committee, and we've all had that experience where you go up and you actually prepare for days, and you go up and maybe 1 or 2 members show up, and there's some congressional staff in the back, and you leave so deflated because you're pouring your heart out to the nation, and there's not much that's heard. But in this particular case, we were testifying on evidence-based policymaking, and every single member of the committee was there. Iconic figures like John Lewis, brand new members of Congress from the Midwest who were highly conservative Republicans. So we felt like we had a representative sample of the Congress. And I happened to use the occasion to say that because there was a hot debate around SNAP, the old food stamps program, and I said, it's interesting because food stamps was a program that was rolled out across the country at different times in the 1960s and 70s. It enabled the Field Foundation to do a longitudinal study to assess the effects of the food stamp program on children and youth. And what it found, in addition to access to nutritious food and all the health benefits, was that there was a recent study showing that it boosted high school graduation rates by 18 percentage points. And what was so interesting to me was after the hearing, we said a lot of other things, some of the conservative Republicans who had been very hostile to the SNAP program came up to me and said, that gives me a different view. Because you're talking about outcomes, real outcomes for children and youth that have sort of a longer trajectory. And so I think that spirit of kind of sticking with the data, sticking with the evidence, marshaling those facts and those compelling stories. The other thing that gives me hope about bipartisanship is that the number of people on this extreme right, Republicans want limited but effective government. So this agenda should be attractive to them, including, do we actually have the courage? One quick example, the William F. Goodwin Even Start family literacy program had been subject to 2 or 3 studies showing that it wasn't effective at boosting literacy rates among children. And yet Congress went on for 8 years to continue to spend more than $1 billion on that program. A lot of counter pressures. Bill Goodling was a teacher and a principal, I think. He was very popular in the Congress. Interest groups were lobbying for the program. But it wasn't all that effective. And so as I think of the Fed and the opportunity cost to children and youth and to local communities of having those resources available for the Reading First program or other programs that actually have evidence of effectiveness, I think that's another key factor in building the bipartisan bridge between Republicans and then Democrats who want to show the efficacy of government programs.
I think John raises through that example with SNAP. Regardless of what your voter registration card says, I mean, I still would really like to believe that most folks go into public service for the right reasons. You can have your philosophy and points of view and all that, but I mean, we're there to serve people, to help improve the quality of life that folks experience and help them reach their potential. And so using evidence and data, I think some of the challenge is just trying to figure out which data points make a difference to whom, right? So the conservative, Republican, maybe they were from farm communities, did walk away with a different kind of experience, whereas some Northeast Democrat might use the data for a different purpose. And so if we ever actually get to the point of talking with each other, as opposed to at each other, or just using the talking points that came from wherever they came from, and just use a little bit of common sense, right? So, I mean, like, why are we having a debate about SNAP? I mean, do kids have too much food? Right. I mean, I know we have overweight and obese conditions, but that, I mean, right? Yeah. Right. I mean, there's a child that's going to go to sleep, go to bed, or their parents tonight hungry, and there's not a lack of food in the United States of America. There's a lack of delivery systems for that food. We feed the world, right? We'll be sending food the next major catastrophe, those what are those, C-130s or whatever. I mean, that food will be coming right out the back of the plane. We have food. We don't deliver it well. Yeah. Right? So there's system issues, and the use, again, of data should be about the least partisan. I mean, the numbers are the numbers, whatever they are. We got, lies, damn lies, and statistics, but I just think that, I mean, you hear about, the speaker and the senator. I mean, at some point in time, I mean, if you're like a serious public servant, I mean, you have to just say, what am I doing? Are we getting anything done? Would that improve anybody's quality of life today? I mean, just when you have that moment, in the mirror in the morning, at night, or whatever the case may be. And, I'd just like to think that this Congress at some point, after we get past, if we ever get past the hysteria of 45, that the other 535 people in this town will actually say, I'd actually like to do something today, right? And
I think we need to run him for Congress.
No, that is the last thing. I would be a danger to myself or to others. No, I'm good.
So since you brought up 45, I'm going to turn to Bridge with the question of...
what a setup.
Yeah, what a setup. Yeah. Are there ways in which you think we can work with the Trump administration to, make facts matter, make evidence and data matter more, was that too partisan?
Alternative facts.
Alternative facts.
So I'll start with the optimism. The thing that gives me hope, I've been on this Partnership for Public Service board. I don't know if anybody knows it, but they give out these Service to America medals, and I've had the privilege of actually giving out some of those. And Max Steyer, do we have a board member here from Partnership for Public Service?
I want to say Lisa Jones last year received
a Service to America medal. Okay. So what gives me hope in the federal government, and even in the White House, is that the people who run the place and run these departments and agencies, and my view is you can't really solve a problem unless you have at least a decade or more of commitment and involvement in it. And so these civil servants who are working day in and day out on complex problems and dealing with issues of data and evidence and evaluation and give me the most hope that we can work with them. Somebody like Kathy Stack, who was at OMB for years and just so knowledgeable and effective at harnessing data and evidence, and now working at the Laura and John Arnold Foundation to continue to advance this agenda. That gives me hope. What's difficult is, again, since President Taft, we've had an executive budget. And when Mitch Daniels and our whole team worked on the budget, it was, a exhausting multi-month process informed by a campaign that had exhaustive proposals that David Gergen said, this campaign's fast becoming the campaign of fresh ideas. And we actually had budget figures in each of those fact sheets and proposals and data and evidence to the extent we could marshal it. And when I called a White House official about the Trump budget, because I was so alarmed, he said to me, "Oh, Bridge, it's a campaign blueprint." And I said, "I'm sorry, you're governing, you're in office."
You won.
Yeah, you won. So it didn't surprise me that, government needs a haircut in certain places, and government needs to scale up and make systems change for programs and systems that are effective in helping targeted populations. But it doesn't need, as I said in a Politico story, the head lopped off. So they came in and General McChrystal and I are working day and night to grow national service in the United States. And they proposed to eliminate the Corporation for National Community Service. Walter Isaacson just wrote a piece in the Washington Post stating that one of the key features of recovery in New Orleans to actually make it better than it was before the hurricane was that you had Teach for America and Team Rubicon and Meals on Wheels. And I know a lot of the organizations in this room today, Citizens Helping Citizens, with federal support from VISTA and AmeriCorps and other programs across government. And so the lack of even basic evidence or basic analysis in the Trump administration alarms me. When I was director of the White House Domestic Policy Council, last comment, the first thing I did was reach back and called Ted Sorensen from Kennedy's administration. He was chief of staff, he had a much bigger job, but they didn't have a Domestic Policy Council director. And then I called Joe Califano and became a really good friend of his. He was in the Johnson administration, and Roger Porter in the Reagan and Bush administrations, and Bruce Reed in the Clinton administration. My point was, you want to draw out all the learnings and evidence about how to do these jobs more effectively across administrations. I have never, nor have any of my colleagues ever received a call from the current director of domestic policy, or a lot of these officials, and that alarms me, because there isn't this sense of continuous learning across administration. You don't get trained to do these jobs almost anywhere, but hopefully you have multi-sector experience to bring to bear and to do them well. But so anyway, sorry, I went on a rant, but I'm really frustrated.
No, we understand.
That's okay.
Yeah, so let me continue the optimism. Michele, we're here, these are folks who make decisions on a daily basis. We're talking about evidence-based programs. There's not one shred of evidence, none, that the current cast of characters, other than General Kelly and a couple others, have any idea what they're doing. And I had not heard that story before, but I'm not surprised, because it has all the look and feel still. This is like Groundhog, it's like it's still 2016. You won. You have to make the transition, especially for executives, city council members and other candidates as well, but especially for the executives. You have to make the transition from candidate to elected, from campaigning to governing. Those are two very, very different things, different mindsets, different agendas, different thought process. A campaign has a finite period of time. It is the ultimate startup. You created it, you build it around you, and then it literally basically goes away until you have your rally 2 months into being in office. So I just don't know that the current president is that interested in governing. I think he wanted to be president. He won, move on, hire some really smart people, give them some focus and direction, and get out of the way and let them do their work. So I wake up, I'm ultimate optimist, and I am hopeful that however they make their decisions, they would actually use some data and some evidence. But at the moment, not a whole lot to back that up. Sorry.
So segueing to the book, taking off on your point of needing sort of a North Star.
You could have told me you were going to stay up till 1 o'clock.
I'm not going to grill you on particular pages, but
I hate being on panels with
concept
overachievers.
No. I just got through the first chapter.
It's a gold star.
My colleague, co-founder David Medina, wrote a chapter for the book talking about the need for governments to know where they're going when they're doing this kind of work, to be able to signal to the providers who provide the services, as well as to others what it is that they intend to do. And so creating these standards helps, sort of what does good look like when government is using evidence and data? What are the things you need to have in place, and what are the kinds of things that governments at all levels should be doing? And so, Bridge, you've helped us at the federal level, and the What Works Cities certification is the same thing, but maybe you could first talk about at the federal level, the chapter on creating this North Star. Why is it so important for government to have sort of a map, a roadmap, a point in which to go toward in order to be able to structure itself to make decisions better?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. People get so immersed in their work. Having a North Star approach, I think, is beneficial to the entire team. One example from history, so the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States was created to combat malaria, of all things, in mostly the southeastern United States, and we did it by about 1960. And this Plasmodium falciparum, this little parasite that has been around since the age of the dinosaurs, is not an easy thing to get out of systems. But we pulled it off, and in part because of the Panama Canal experience. But interestingly, the federal government had 1.2 million people were dying, mostly women and children, in sub-Saharan Africa. And the federal government, even though it has this big USAID budget, was spending a tiny fraction of money on malaria and AIDS and other diseases. And driven by evidence, driven by a framework and targeting, the government identified 15 sub-Saharan African countries that were disproportionately killing women and children from a fully preventable and treatable disease called malaria. And there are 4 interventions: bed nets, ACTs for treatment, IPT for pregnant women, and rapid diagnostic testing. And these long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets, which was a huge civic opportunity where you as an individual, Valerie Bartlett, could for $10 buy a bed net and save not only 2 lives, but because of the insecticide on the net, you'd kill all these mosquitoes in the community, helping to save other lives. And so government got organized around clear goals, a framework driven by evidence of what was effective, and then Nobel laureate economists came forward and said this is the most effective return on investment on the planet. And government, interestingly, and this to their credit, we want a little optimism, right? Yeah. The Trump budget, the one program that I'm aware of that it not only did not cut but increased was funding for the president's malaria initiative, because the return on investment is so dramatic, and it's such a strong public-private sector initiative. The other thing, hats off to Michele and David Medina and the whole team. They created a federal index. It sounds boring, but it's actually really effective. No, but it's
the marketing guy.
1 o'clock in the morning reading, right?
Right.
It's these 10 criteria from leadership to evaluation to do the 5 largest competitive grant programs in your department and agency actually draw on evidence, and places like the Corporation for National Community Service. Any AmeriCorps grantees in the crowd? So there's some. When you put in your grant applications now, the corporation, awards like 12 out of the 100 points for evidence-backed programming. And that's a really good development, because over time, and all these scores across the 7 departments and agencies that are measured, keep creeping up because just like the, best places to work scale, people want to do well on these indices and they want to improve their performance. So I think that's optimistic.
And at the city level, we have the What Works Cities standard and the What Works Cities certification. And I'll just say this: it's been overwhelming response by cities who have sought to be certified as a What Works City. You've been an advisor on that. You've been helping lead it. You've been a spokesperson. Why is that so important, you think, to mayors?
Well, a couple things. I mean, again, kind of keying off of something John said, as has been said by one certainly smarter than me, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there, right? In the government, right? I mean, you right? What are we doing here, right? What's the agenda? Are we trying to lower crime, increase high school, graduation, pre-K? I mean, whatever your thing is, and then you have to be able to measure it because you want to start at a baseline of this is what it was the day before I arrived, or the day of. Our goal is to do X. Our strategy is Y. And the outcome is going to be Z. I mean, it is literally almost kind of like a formula. And you lay that out, again, as I said in the earlier discussion, with focus and direction. Cities, leaders, governments actually want to perform. They want to be high performing. And as we say with our children, if you set the bar high, they will knock themselves out trying to reach it. Well, it's the same thing with cities. They're highly competitive, competing for, in the business language, we're in a daily competition for market share, right? If I deliver a high quality product at the lowest possible cost, I will increase my market share, meaning my citizens will either stay or more will come, right? So, I mean, it's a lot of the same, business tools and some of that language. And so getting certified as being a place for best practices, I mean, even our great marketeer, John here, I mean, you could take that and promote your city. Who's going to pay attention to that? Companies, investors, young people, or millennials, or whatever they want to be called these days. And it's a source of pride, right? And so, yes, there's been a significant amount of outreach. But I think also, again, in the federal example, I mean, my dream about this, and we've talked about this, and Simone Brody back at the shop and others, that being certified, not only being a What Works Cities, but city, but getting that certification should be an entry point for whether it's additional Bloomberg grants, or it can name a half a dozen foundations who would be looking for that, and whether it's the additional 5 points, 10 points, whatever the case may be, you will increasingly find more and more cities wanting to do that. And if we had the same going on in the federal government for the grant-related programs, which there will be more of, probably, unfortunately, a little less funding on the formula side. That seems to be the direction of this administration. And some of this is a carryover from President Obama's administration. But if that's where we're going, then how do you make decisions other than political as to who should get what grant, right? They've set a certain standard. This is how they operate. Yes, they have a Bloomberg certification or a Joe Schmo certification, and we're going to put 5 points on top of that. People will clamor for that. They want to compete and be the best in the marketplace. And then, quite honestly, as I say, the greatest compliment is that others are replicating what you do. I mean, many of the ideas that we brought forward in Philadelphia did not come out of my mind. Certainly came from some really brilliant staff, but also we borrowed ideas from a number of other cities across the United States of America. Cities are always on each other's websites trying to see what's the latest, what's the newest, what are they do, what's happening in New York, what's Atlanta doing, what's San Francisco up to, what's going on in Chicago. And we borrow those ideas, give credit, and move on.
And so with the certification process, the goal is to have as many cities as possible becoming like LEED certified. Like, do you want to talk a little bit more about it? Because I feel like we've jumped right into the content of it. And there's a chapter in here about sort of North Stars and the kind of need to set a goal. But.
And I think you laid it out well in terms of an example. So, it was, 10, 15 years ago, when no one could actually remember what LEED stood for. It was I want to get LEED certified buildings. I mean, I would brag all over the place that we had, GSK, Glaxo, built a double platinum LEED certified $90 million building in Philadelphia. And the marketplace said, what? And so numerous developers wanted to try to meet that standard. I mean, there's always that push. So same thing with certification and I think it's, what are we doing? Gold,
Platinum, gold,
platinum,
silver,
gold,
yeah.
silver. And we will walk you through a process to see where you are in terms of using evidence. How do you evaluate your programs? But I think the newest, excuse me, the newest component for What Works Cities is what I'm also excited about is repurpose. All right, so again, John made reference to a program that was being funded for 8 years while all the evidence said, all right, look, there's virtually nothing harder in government than to end a program. Yeah. They will just outlast you, they will outlive you. We have this thing in government, we talk about the B team in government. If you don't know, it's not a diminishing kind of thing. The B team in government is, we'll be here when you get here, we'll be here when you leave. Yeah. Right? And those are the people who actually run the place, right? Yeah. We just kind of rent our chairs. They're like permanent, and they make things happen, or not, right? So, they can speed up a decision, slow walk it. If you can't put a mayor off for at least a year on anything he or she asks for, you will lose your certification in like public service, right? Because you got to have a meeting, then we got to have more meetings, and then we write a report, then we have a draft. No, we got to go back, right? And then they know we're going to forget.
Spoken like a two-term mayor. Right. Yeah.
Right. Still trying to get some reports out of people. Been out of office for a year and a half. So when it comes time, and these programs, they all have a constituency. We were forced to do much of that, not just because we wanted to, and we would have gone in that direction, but we had the Great Recession. And one of the big lessons, of course, is it really is hard to run a government with no money. And so you're forced to evaluate and reevaluate literally every dollar that's being spent. And we brought every one of our service providers in and basically ran them through a process. Who are you? What do you do? How long you've been funded? How many people do you serve? And people, well, we are citywide. We do citywide serving 17 people. I'm sorry. Right. And your outcomes are, well, the kids are happy. Fantastic. So I cannot afford your nostalgia. I know you've been getting funded for the last 15 years. Over the next 2 to 3 years, your funding will go to zero. I'm sorry. Because it's not working. And we're going to repurpose those dollars into programs that actually work and serve people. And so just because the money's going out the door, and just because Joe Schmo has been funded for the last 15 years, and they're wonderful, and they're nice, and all of that, fantastic. Who are you serving? How many people? What are the benchmarks? What are the standards? And what are the outcomes? End of conversation. Right? And that's very tough politically. You will not make a lot of friends, but that wasn't why I came.
And so you were able to do that in part because of the recession and the lack of the work you're doing now with the What Works Cities team on this new repurposing for results is trying to make this a regular practice in government, knowing that we're not going to have an excess of dollars coming from government. So how do you make every dollar count?
There are now kind of two groups of mayors. There's the pre-recession mayors and the post-recession mayors. And I think, and more, of course, we have more and more post-recession mayors. And so I think the mindset has changed. The use of evidence really is growing in the marketplace. More and more of the mayors are thinking about it in that way. And no matter, even with a balanced budget, you know that you will never have all the resources that you need. And so, again, I don't want to get people too nervous, but this idea that, some of the concepts of running a government like a business, are appropriate and helpful. And I think that you will find more and more mayors making these tough decisions in non-financial disaster circumstances because they want outcomes. And we are getting the big notice over here.
I'm so busy listening to you. I'm getting a big discernment.
So right out of the corner of my eye.
Excellent. All right, so we will now wrap up our discussion here and open it up to the folks who are here listening for questions, I think.
And I've got the questions in the back.
Okay, and so you're going to
already.
read
Great.
them.
Thank you, everybody, for who contributed your questions. Here's the first. How do we educate voters to reward elected officials who do hard work of shifting to a results-different approach? Cutting programs that don't work often penalizes elected officials in the eyes of voters.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I meet the person who encourages me to end a program, or when I was in, that would be the first time we had ever talked to each other. You are not normally getting citizens coming in to talk about these kinds of things. Usually they're there to advocate for themselves and their own programs that may or may not be working. But I think that helping the public better understand, so this is all about transparency. To some extent. And I think you really have to be upfront on the government side. This is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is how we evaluate programs, and more importantly to the citizens, and these are the outcomes you should expect. And really help folks to understand, you know, it actually is important how quickly we pick up your trash, what the routes are, how we end the day, how much should we collect, all of those kinds of things. The transparency in government and that education process, I think, is critical to helping folks understand and then make that reward to the folks who are utilizing that kind of process.
And when you had the, the need to repurpose dollars in Philadelphia, I know you went through an extensive community engagement process, knowing that there was going to be this backlash, and so you were seeking to, sort of educate people about why this was necessary. Can you talk a little bit about that, so that, because I think learning from that, knowing that going forward we're going to have to do this more just as a matter of practice. Yeah. What sorts of community engagement tools did you use?
So I came in right before the recession, or as it was happening, we didn't know, and so 2 days after the '08 election, which at least for me and some other folks, maybe one of the most historic elections in our lives. 2 days after that, I announced that Philadelphia had a $1.4 billion 5-year plan deficit. Talk about life of the party. I'm sorry, let me see. Last week, the Phillies won the World Series. 2 days later, we had a parade with 2 million people. Tuesday, we elected the first black president. And on Thursday, you're telling us that we have a $1.4 billion 5-year plan. You must be really stupid. So we then embarked and had 8 town hall meetings right after that, which was possibly one of the dumbest ideas ever.
No, that was good.
500 to 600 people came out, shouted at us for about 3 hours, told us how stupid we were, and we listened. But we learned a lot. And we used a lot of that information to, when the shouting subsided and temperature went down, to better understand what people really wanted and what they cared about. And I tailored our 2009 fiscal year 10, budget to try to address many of those issues and needs. Kind of in a we heard you, kind of way, but we still don't have any money. And we continued to utilize some of that process, even through the recovery and even when things got better. Communication, and I talked to a lot of elected officials about this, regardless of level of service, I think communication is an undervalued resource in government. And somehow, some way, some convince themselves, well, if we just don't get into it, if we just don't engage, either they won't notice or they won't be upset with me. Look. If you have a need to be loved and admired every day, this is not the business for you. You should go work in a pet shop. If you ran, you won, you get to make tough decisions, right? Right? That's kind of the way that goes. But communication, I think, is critical, and being honest with people about what you can do, what you can't do, and then demonstrate through results and outcomes that you actually did what you said you were going to do.
That wonderful question, by the way, just at the federal level, in terms of points of leverage, when we used to go in and brief the member of Congress, you'd take all the data and information, including what the constituents wanted and what the various effects would be of the law. But Citizens Against Government Waste was part of the formula. And I think if there was, like the federal index, a congressional index of some kind, or some kind of mechanism, at least members of Congress are made aware of the state of the evidence with respect to the programs they're supporting. At a minimum, it would get the programs and the grantees to up their game.
Right.
And a maximum, maybe, it's tough, but maybe programs that weren't effective, wouldn't slide through. So I think there needs to be some kind of mechanism at the federal level too.
Okay, good segue for the next question. Lots of people ask this one in different forms. What role, if any, should the government play in building the capacity of service providers who may be doing good work but are unable to measure it? If not government, who?
I think that's actually an interesting role. I see Sterling Spurn and some of the great figures in philanthropy over time. I think that's a great role for the third sector and philanthropy, because it's tough in government. I mean, you're called up, you're subject to congressional oversight. You've got to stand before and testify with respect to various programs. And I think there certainly is a role for government in innovation and experimentation. I love the I3 program that I think Michele played a big role in developing, that it took kind of a tiered evidence approach and gave more federal funding to programs that had more evidence, but also built this sense of innovation and continuous learning. But I also do think that we have national service. There are more than $1 billion that are invested alongside $1 billion investment from the federal government. And I think a lot of that funding actually is, right now, the Artist Year created by Yo-Yo Ma and Damian Weitzel is now being brought to scale nationally because it worked in your hometown of Philadelphia. Yep. Connecting, low-performing students in high-need schools to an interest like art and music with the greatest musicians in the world. Mm-hmm. That took off, and now the federal government is bringing it to scale. But it took private philanthropy to actually innovate and test that model.
So if the if the federal government, the role may not be as clear for how to invest in capacity of service providers. At the local level, were there any examples of Philadelphia helping service providers become better at measuring, becoming better at being able to tell their story of impact?
So we would, there was, now it was Delaware Valley Grantmakers. It's now the Philanthropy Network, I think that's the name. We would bring our philanthropic community together on a pretty regular basis. One, primarily to talk about our own programs and services, and different people, kind of almost like a menu. Folks, I want to support that, I want to do that. Fine, it's all on the menu. But I mean, I am a firm believer in really kind of the built-in evaluation component to grants. One, I would think the philanthropy wants to know, great presentation, your 900 pages of application were fantastic. What do we really get out of this? And I think it then serves the provider well to be able to say, hey, government, we're doing this program, we're funded by philanthropy, we've had an evaluation, it actually worked, therefore you should put $5 more into this program as well. And so I think that government should encourage it, but that it really should be more along the lines of what John was laying out, this kind of this third party evaluation. And I think that is a great model. We insisted in many of our grant opportunities that there be a built-in evaluation component.
Other questions?
We're at time. I know that there were a lot of other questions we didn't get to, and if you can call on me, maybe we can ask you the questions afterwards and publish the answers on our website. Would that be okay?
Can we do one more?
One more.
I've got one more. Deja vu all over again. We started this in 1990. Why not more progress? Maybe that's too depressing to end on that.
Yeah.
Sorry, bad choice.
No, we're not taking any more questions. Nope. We're finished. I don't know. I mean, I got here as soon as I could. I wasn't in the government in 1990.
That's right.
I mean, I'd like to think there's been some progress. And, we can debate how much, not enough. Change, I mean, we've heard, President Obama say this, kind of a million times. I mean, change actually does take time. It's not a single president, a single governor, a single mayor, a couple council members, state reps, members of Congress. You know, we do what we do. So a little bit of pushback on that. I mean, your job was not done when you voted. That was a start. Part of citizenship is your participation, not only in the voting booth, but the other 363 days where you hold us accountable as you would someone working on your house, right? You hire somebody to do a job. Here's the scope of services. You either did it or you didn't. But if it's not right, I'm calling you up. A, I'm not going to pay you. And I'm going to call you up and say, you know, the ceiling is whatever, or the garage is, or the dent, or, like, what are you doing? Don't send us to City Hall, state capitals, Washington, D.C., and not hold us accountable for the work that we do. We work for you. You hired me to do a job. If I'm not doing it, you should say something. That's how you get us to do our work.
That was wonderful. I would just add, you know, I see these.
I was up till 1 o'clock working on that.
Well done. I see little hope spots. You know, there's been a concerted effort on high school graduation rates. Yes, there's concern about the Wild West of homeschooling. Yes, there's concern about credit recovery, alternative schools. But 2.8 million students in the United States, more students have graduated rather than dropping out in the last decade. And dropout factory high schools have been cut in half. And African Americans and Latinos have actually led the way, including a doubling of college enrollment for both populations. That's pretty hopeful. And that was because there was actually some clear goals. 4 US presidents had set the same goal. There had never been a plan to actually try to reach it, and driven by evidence, and fabulous people like Mayor Nutter in Philadelphia that, you know, stick to it. So I think the laboratories of American democracy are actually working. Teenage pregnancy, the Teenage Pregnancy Prevention Program, which is fabulous, has all sorts of outcomes studied. I think the Trump budget, you know, cuts it. That's discouraging. But there are all these hope spots, and I think if we shine a light on them, build the evidence base, and hold our public officials accountable for real progress over time, maybe it'll be a little less deja vu all over again.
Good way to end. Excellent. Well, join me in thanking our two panelists.